All right, so welcome everybody. I'm using my outside voice. Sean, since I can actually see your little video, can you give me a thumbs up if the people online can hear me okay? Nice. Okay, well, welcome all. This is the Rolling Deck Repository, or R2R breakout session. I'll be giving a quick overview of R2R, and then we'll flow into a couple of other quick presentations, and then the bulk of the session is going to be about operator feedback, guidance on recommended practices, and there'll be room in there for discussion. Okay. The first thing I'd like to do is ask all the R2R people to please stand up and wave so people have a visual for who you are. We have a few members here who this is their first RV tech. They have the little R2R badge, so please make them feel welcome as part of the community. Our second request for you is that if you are a tech on a vessel, please make sure that somebody from your vessel comes if they didn't come today to our lunchtime check-in, that comes to our lunchtime check-in tomorrow at the lamprey room, or if you're not able to do that, connect with us outside. This is a real good opportunity for us to give you some feedback about how data from your vessel are going, see if we have any requests, find out whether you've got issues or challenges. Okay, I know we have a lot of old timers here. We also have some new people. So I was going to do just super quick what R2R is and what it does. I think many of you know we get the data from the vessel, but you might not know a lot about what we do with it then. So we take the post-cruise data distribution for the routine underway instrumentation. We break it out by data type. You all have different, well, not everybody, but there are a variety of different directory structures and file naming protocols. So we need to work with you to understand that. We break it all out by data type. For a subset of the data types, we do some quality assessment, quality control. This is a QA dashboard. It's accessible from the left-hand side menu of the rvdata.us website. What you can do is you can pick a vessel, you can pick an instrument, and then you can kind of get a quick view of the quality results from that device. Sometimes that helps highlight if you see kind of a whole column of yellow or red lamps that might indicate a persistent issue. As I mentioned, we produce quality control data products, again, for a select subset of the data, mostly navigation, XBT, CTD, and the TrackLine geophysics suite. We publish all of this, make it searchable and accessible from the rvdata.us website. We have a cruise catalog with landing pages for every cruise. We have DOIs, cruise DOIs, as well as data set DOIs that we use sort of to connect data from this cruise to data in other repositories for this cruise. And then we also provide the data, all the data that NOAA will accept, we submit to the National Centers for Environmental Information. That's the US National Ocean Data Center. That creates an additional sort of discovery access point for the community. But another really important thing that happens when these data get to NCEI is that they get included in these global aggregated gridded products. Things like the magnetic anomaly grid, the bathymetry aggregations, the World Ocean Database. And these are usable and accessible to a whole lot of scientists that are not really able to kind of handle direct instrument data. So that's a really important use for these data. So everything I've talked about so far is post-cruise data distribution. We have two pieces of work that get closer to being on the vessel with you guys. The first is the at-sea event logger. This is used to log, to create structured, searchable records of what happened on the ship, both for science party use and technician events. Becca and Snehal are here from that group, and you'll hear a little bit more from Becca in a few slides. And then there's SAMOS, which is near real-time data coming off the vessels for the Met and TSG. Sean Smith, who again will speak with you in a moment, leads that. So we're gonna now flow into a couple of other short presentations. We have a proposal pending with NSF. We have 5-year funding increments. We're getting near the end of our current one. We've got a proposal pending. Fingers crossed on that. Most of that proposal is ongoing operations and maintenance for R2R. We're going to keep on keeping on with what we do. But there are a couple of new pieces of work that we're proposing there. And so we're going to talk about them briefly, and then we're going to roll into sort of our recommended practices section of the talk. But I'd just like to finish by saying a big thank you to all of you. Over the years, we have something like 22 million downloadable data files have come, and this all has a big science impact. I know you're all busy every day when you're out on those ships, and these instruments take time, but the data are worth it. So thank you for that. Okay, Sean, I think I mute now, and then if you could just say next slide.
That works if you can hear me. All right, go ahead and go to the next slide. First of all, I just wanted to mention that I'm bummed that I'm not actually there with you all. This is about the second or third RV Tech that I've missed in the last 25 years. So I've been doing this almost as long as Allison. It's a great group of people, and I really enjoy working with y'all. So one of the things that we're proposing, I'm sure some of you have heard of FAIR. It was actually brought up by Katie in her talk as well. This idea of making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And so one of the things that we're proposing in our next NSF award is to establish a FAIR working group, a group that will actually look at how to make the data coming off the vessels meet the FAIR principles when the data is actually collected. And so these first two slides are just kind of a summary of the principles. These were developed by NASA in a guide for FAIR data that I helped co-author as well. And so just, highlighting in yellow some of the key principal parts of making data findable, have to use persistent globally unique identifiers and describe everything with really rich metadata and catalog it. And of course, that's one of the things R2R does. We have a catalog of all these data. Making the data accessible, again, it's metadata, and more metadata. You have to be able to carry all this metadata along with the observations, and you actually want to use open, free, and standard protocols for transferring the data and making it available. So that's things like, used to be FTP, but then it's like now these days it's things like OpenDAP and, some of the other protocols that are available for sharing data and making it accessible. Next slide. The interoperability part is where the challenges really come in. And this is where you're dealing with every ship does things slightly different in terms of the data files and the formats and, which variables they extract out of different serial strings for air temperature or whatever. And so it's really challenging to make data sets from different ships interoperable. In order to do this, this is where we have to work toward this idea of accepted data models, standardized formats, and utilizing things like controlled vocabularies for the data. And things like some of the systems like Coriolis and some other, the newer data acquisition systems will help facilitate this down the road. And then reusability really has to, again, to do with adhering to those relevant and domain standards. Some of these don't actually exist in our field, in where we're working, and may have to be developed. The community may have to come back and together and develop standards for the types of data that we work with. So next slide. So over the years, R2R has really been working toward FAIR standards, I think somewhat even before FAIR was a thing. But some of the things that we do to help with the findability are things like, we utilize, we have a cruise catalog, the individual data packages that we bag up for archival for each device type, use standardized metadata. They have persistent IDs on them, so they're easily traceable. So this is the kind of thing we work toward in R2R. Accessibility, again, we're working on, we have persistent links. So the data sets are either accessible from NCEI, where they're permanently archived, or from the landing pages at R2R for those data sets that are yet to get into the National Archives. Next slide. Okay, so what we're actually proposing, and this is just kind of a brief summary of what's in the proposal, is to establish a working group under the academic fleet to look into how do you move the underway data collection to meeting FAIR standards. The idea would be to compose a working group that includes members of R2R, members from your community, the marine techs, some data managers and archivists, and some FAIR experts. People are actually experts in the FAIR principles and concepts. And then we kind of laid out a charge to the working group where we would basically review existing FAIR implementation plans and procedures in geosciences, and then figure out what's the current FAIR readiness for different data types on the ships. So multi-beam might be much closer to FAIR because it uses a much more standard data, format and protocols, whereas things like meteorology data are much more all over the place because we have multiple instruments and devices we're dealing with. So this working group would help assess the different data sets and where they are using existing assessment tools that have been developed in the FAIR community. And then the goal would be to then start developing device-specific plans for the data collected on the academic fleet and the metadata to make sure that we're moving toward aligning with the FAIR protocols when the data is actually collected, as opposed to waiting for when it's going into the archive. It's much easier to do it and get it ready if you do it when the data is collected. So that's just an overview. We haven't heard whether this will be funded, but we are hoping that this will be part of our next 5 years in the R2R program.
Hello, everyone. My name is Becca Hudak. I work at HUI as part of the R2R project. And one of the big things I do is the R2R event logger using eLog. One of our new proposed ideas is event log harvesting. And what this really means, so this ships obviously take underway data measurements of environmental sensor data, and it's very high value for reuse of science members. So a scientist can go back to a cruise 5 years later, 6 years later, and see, oh, this is a CTD that went down and we had to abort the CTD because the wave action was too high. Or this pump was stopped and this TSG data might not be good anymore. That has a lot of good value and puts into kind of perspective of what that data is happened, like what happened to the data on the ship during the cruise. So one of the things that we are proposing is machine-to-machine harvesting of the R2R event logger. What this looks like would be an API script that can look at the event logger. We get the event logger in near real time every 30 minutes to our shore server. So groups like Samos could then harvest those actions specifically for MET sensors and say, hey, we swapped out this sensor and calibrated it. This is the calibration file. The idea is that this would reduce emails from the technicians to Samos. We know technicians' time is very important and you guys have a lot to do. Event logger being one of the lower priorities. This is kind of a nice little image of what we propose. So it could be wind sensors. Sean also does underway systems, so pumps turning on, turning off. If you have more than one pump, which pump is running, when it's running, how long it's running. If you have sea state, that might be affecting the pump. all of that information is very important. I could talk event log all day, every day. But we really want you to be running the event logger, not just if science requests it, but for every single voyage, every cruise that you're doing, because technician events are important. Yeah, that's kind of I'm gonna get off the soapbox. But if you have any other questions about event logger, please reach out to me and I'll be happy to answer them.
I think before we roll into, sorry guys, into the best practices, if there are any questions on the presentation, okay, this is a great time.
Any questions from people online if they did not hear Karin?
Hi everyone, I'm Gwen Hayes. I work with R2R at LDEO, and this is my first RV tech. Before I let George introduce himself, I'm gonna say a little bit about why we're talking about this. We're here to discuss recommended data practices for submitting and managing data to R2R. And our goal is to ensure, I had this memorized right before I walked up here. Our goal is to ensure the highest quality data is being collected and submitted to R2R. And by collaborating with operators and technicians, we're able to optimize the processes for data collection, submission, and storage, which ultimately improves its value for future research.
You did have enough. Hi, everyone. I'm George Dubinian. I work with the R2R team. I'm on the R2R team, and I work at SIO Scripps. So, let's see. Oh, perfect. The goal of this, or the purpose of this talk, is to help you, the operators, help us with making the data workflow as smooth and easy and painless as possible, and also faster and with better data which helps the end user. One obvious way to achieve this is just to make sure that we are seeing your data distributions, which I'll be calling distros from now on, as soon as possible. So sooner rather than later. Seeing data sooner allows us to head start that process of opening a dialogue with you guys if there's something that doesn't look right with the data, if there's issues, if there's errors, anything that needs to have communication between operators. We like to get on that as soon as possible. So if we can see your data distribution staged once every 3 months, at least, that's perfect. So if you can empty your backlog, that's great. Also, in a similar vein, we want to make sure that because we're a repository and not an archive, we are not making any, if possible, any revisions or edits to the data that's coming through us. This is doubly so when the data that we're seeing is pushed off to a place like NCEI, a permanent archive. We want to do our absolute best to make sure that we are not changing the data at all. And when possible, we'll make documentation to make this revision known, but not actually applied to the data. So in short, we would prefer to receive the distros a little later than now and receiving and needing to have revisions down the road. Another kind of more recent ask we're going to start with is we want to start seeing those really big file sets that specific devices produce, kind of separated off. Talking about the SBP29, EK80 are common culprits. They generate very large, voluminous file sets breaking into the terabytes. And when we have these 500 gigabyte plus file sets, we want to see those getting separated off. When the distros are sent to us, we want to see those as separate distros from the rest of the distro. This will allow us to kind of split up that bottleneck and prevent the bottlenecking of the vast majority of the data, which isn't as big as that. And so we can get started on that data and kind of worry about that edge case, really large data, oversized data separately. And if we're going to see these, one specific ask we have is that you keep that directory structure consistent in the separate distro compared to the original distro. So the file tree shouldn't be altered. You should be able to do like a Linux file-wise merge, and they should come out to the same distro. All right, we also really want to stress that we look at the MD5 deep files, MD5_summary, whatever, .md5 deep. These files are important to us for ensuring that the data, that the distros that you send to us, that every file in those is present and accounted for on our end. It's really the only surefire way that we have to do this. And it's super important because even if like sometimes we'll see specific hashes kind of being skipped in some of the large file sets, if those are skipped, we have no way of ensuring that the data wasn't damaged or that there aren't bytes missing during the transfer. So this is the only real like fail list check that we have for that. So including those MD5D files is a big ask. You know, acquisition systems often do this for you, and that's great. So I don't want to stress that. We also pay really, really close attention to file names. We actually have a system that looks at the date strings in file names. It looks at those strings and it's going to verify that, checking it against our cruise level metadata to make sure that the data files that we're seeing belong to the right dates and we're collecting the right dates that we would expect. And if that's not the case, we might send you an email and maybe work out why we're seeing data that we weren't expecting to, or we're missing data that we were expecting. So file names are really important. Those date strings are absolutely something we check. There's also a specific technicality where the use of Julian day in those strings kind of causes an issue with our automatic system. So if you can use the regular date string format and you use on regular like government documents, that'd be great. Also, file naming is really important because when you have weird special characters in your files, they can cause issues for scripts. For example, in one of these, it caused an issue. That second one, this comma was read as a delimiter in a CSV parser. So it caused all kinds of havoc, which maybe you guys are nodding your head. You can see why that one might be kind of weird to see. This is an issue not just for our tools, but for tools from downstream processes, from people like NCEI. You never know what a stray apostrophe might do. So try to avoid including those in your file names. All right. The process of mapping out devices to the data that maps onto those devices that was produced by those devices is actually pretty manual for us. We need to manually look at your distros and verify what data was generated by which device. And if the data tree looks different for every single distro, we're going to have to do that for each distro. So it really, really helps us to see a standardized distro structure so that our parsers are not needed, so that we are not required to or do not need to validate our regexes against the new distro. We can just have one regex that applies to all the distros that we see. We're able to process the data much, much sooner, right? So I say that just to say that we really, really want to see standardized directory structures. Acquisition systems also help with this. That's really awesome. And this is a good way to prevent us from not grabbing data and associating it to devices, right? Because that would definitely happen if a regex is picking up stuff in one directory, it's in another directory, it's not going to find those, right? If we're not expecting. So standardized directory structures, surefire way to make sure that that missing file thing doesn't happen. We want to really move away from physical hard drives. Physical hard drives have all kinds of issues. It's much easier for us to just see data sent to us over the network instead of over physical disks. The way we're looking to achieve that is with Globus. Globus has a lot of checks that it does on data. There's a security check, there's a file integrity check, and we have a lot of stress relieved when we know that a file was sent and had all of those different systems for checking that bytes weren't lost during the transfer and all that. Globus is also, from our experience, very performant. So we think it's a really suitable tool for achieving that physical-less transfer. And we are happy to help you set up Globus. So please talk to any of us. There'll be a slide so you can identify us. Yes, we'd be more than happy to talk with you about that. All right, so these are some specific kind of data specific asks. They might be stuff you're familiar with. I'm sure the first one is probably something you think about. Empty file sets, R2R obviously can't do anything with that. I think these are usually the result of some kind of a glitch, but it's worth checking on why there might be 0-byte file sets in your distro that you're sending us. So definitely want to check for those. The second bullet point, these are documentation specific asks. So, and we can dive into more of these in the questions if you have questions about them, but we do want to see documentation around the gravity ties and the magnetometer layback, usually in that top level docs directory. We see that in a lot of distros. And then the last bullet point is also another 0-byte issue we sometimes see. Or it's a missing data issue in some of the files we don't see navigation. So we can talk more about that in the question section if you have any. And then the final ask is, as we move into kind of a new system where we're vamping up our documentation, we're looking to be able to harvest and to use the device format text documents and device format documents that we get from you that describe your data, so that we can check that in our database that it matches the actual files, the actual data lines in the files that we're seeing. So this is going to help us to check that there isn't anything wrong with the data, that our expected file formats match what's expected. And also, if we see better documentation for our device file formats, then that directly helps the end user too, right? They'll be able to know more about the kind of columns and the kind of NEMA tags and the date strings, all of that you would expect to see in, the navigation file, for example. So here's one example of a well-defined out device format document. At the top, it's kind of a high-level description, a listing of the NEMA tags if they're in that file, and also kind of a listing of like their preponderance, whether they're alternating below that, specific data specific, descriptions about the way the Unix time is represented in the document. And then below that is a listing out of all of the columns. So an example data line, example record, and then also just what those columns mean, what units they're in, and then a description of the NEMA tag. If there's multiple, you'd have multiple of these sections. If you don't have a NEMA tag, you don't need to list that out, obviously, but it's great to have that column listed out so that we can automatically check that those units and those values that we're seeing right there match what's in the data files. So we think that can be a really useful and powerful check on our end that we can automate. This is the short list for the documentation specific asks that we have. So just to refresh your memory, if you have any questions, just refresh your memory, and then we'll go ahead.
And then we have, if you're looking for some more information on data submission, we have some documentation for that on our website. You can scan the QR code and it'll take you right to that page. I'll just give you a few seconds to do that right now if you want, because I know we want to have some time for discussion and questions at the end. There's also a link to the page if anyone's viewing these slides later. And then I have another QR code for you for our best practices / recommended practices page. We have a link here as well. Yeah. And then this is us, all of us. Most of us are here in person at RV Tech, except for Sean, unfortunately. He's up there. If you have any questions at all that don't get answered in the breakout today, please feel free to find any of us while we're at RV Tech, or email us at info@rvdata.us and we'll connect you with the right person to help you. Yeah. Oh, and then we have some questions for all of you. These are available to answer on Whova, or you can answer them right now. Either one.
And just to kickstart the discussion, if you guys have some questions, if you want to open that dialogue up right now. So great time for questions. Yeah.
As my software is probably one of the biggest contributors to your MD5s being all asterisks. This guy. The reason for that is it has to do with computational time to calculate an MD5 checksum on a multi-gigabyte file.
Right.
If you were to do that as like a batch job at the end of the cruise, go to lunch, go to dinner, it's going to take a while.
Yeah.
And so basically, that's the reason you're seeing a lot of that. Now in my code, I do provide the option to find the threshold at which a file is deemed too big.
Mm-hmm.
Getting some guidance on what that is, we can kind of try to find, that sweet spot to having a system that's performance that isn't requiring the tech to babysit excessively at the end of the cruise.
Yeah.
While still providing as complete an MD5 checksum record as possible. I'd be really curious. I mean, that's probably an offline topic. But yeah, I saw those asterisks. I was like, oh, I wrote that. But I'm happy to find out what that sweet spot is, because right now we're it's based more on how long does it take, not best on what's best for the data.
Right. Yeah, I would say we normally see those asterisks all centered on specific devices. So usually the vast majority of the files will not have those asterisks. Specific files that we expect to be large, which typically are very large, they do have those. So that there is kind of a clear delimiter there. Maybe we can make more of a trade-off just to check at least some of those files. At least some of those large files weren't damaged. So maybe you can do it on off, but maybe that's a good offline.
It's definitely important. It's the reason that functionality exists in OpenVDM. But that delimiter exists because when we started dealing with 40, 50, 60, 100 terabyte cruises.
Yeah,
That we're dealing with eDNA data, 8K video,
Yeah.
and that, it was like, okay, for us to do an MP5 on a 20 gig file. That just became time prohibitive. It would take a week at the end of the cruise to calculate the MP5s.
yeah.
So it's, yeah, so it's, but, you know, is there a different checksum more efficient that we could move to? Is there, anyway,
Yeah, and just to say, we don't worry too much about serving up 8K video. So maybe we could just categorize certain devices for which we don't really worry about the like waiting a long time to compute that MD5. So I think that's a very valuable dialogue we can have. Yeah.
and I'd be interested in discussing it. Right now, I do it based on file size. That
Yeah.
doesn't mean I can't do it based on file size and collection system.
Mhm.
Meaning, you know, don't do files over X number of kilobytes unless it's EKD.
Yeah.
And so I'd be curious to get feedback because I wrote it once, I can write it again.
Yeah, that would be great. I think we'll take you up on that.
So I'm happy to have that.
Great. Yeah, thanks for asking. What else? Any other questions? Any feedback? Biggest challenge working with us? Go ahead.
Sorry, because I'm actually using the exact same slide that you showed of best practice. That actually is in my presentation as well, because that's what we do, is we actually use what you guys said. The QA dashboard,
Mhm.
our stuff has mechanisms to actually implement that in near real time, and then the ability to basically send the dashboard output
Hmm.
to Sunflare. If that information, what QA are you doing, what checks are you doing, what ranges are you doing, if that information is available, then that's something that we can add to our current plugin architecture, so
Mhm.
that we're actually doing those in near real time. And then we can just send the output, which would be 100 kilobytes versus the raw data file that just lets you know, hey, here's your statistical information on the file. This is your temporal bounds, your geo bounds, your min max, all that stuff. And your time series data, the alias still, or resampled to like 1 minute.
Uh-huh.
And if you ever saw the old Falcor status page, that's how that was driven. We basically condensed, 15 gigabytes a day into like half a megabyte a day for doing that. It had full statistical picture. So with that information, we were just winging it.
Yeah.
I was talking with Chris Olson on the nav stuff, and it turns out I was accidentally doing exactly what he was doing. But if we can get more of that, hey, here's the dashboard stuff, the QA that we're running. If that information is published, it's trivial for us to deploy that on our system, so that we're doing that in your.
Is that like a request for an API for you to like grab that
No,
info?
I've seen the math.
Okay.
And when we
Is that-
did work with Coriolis to get the navigation checks, that's in the system.
Yep.
So we kind of started that path, but to continue it on with you to get.
Yeah, and are you doing it, are they doing it based on just time series or by file?
In this case, I think they were just doing it in real time.
Yeah. So my architecture is based on files, so you basically get the quality on a per file basis.
And ours is by cruise.
Okay,
So we have 3 different files in the QA.
well, I don't want to derail the conversation, but I'd love to take it offline, and that's the reason I'm here, so I'm interested in having my stuff do more of the work that you guys want to have done, so that way we know the data needs attention sooner than at the time.
Right, absolutely. Yes. And
Well, one question on what you just mentioned earlier about the MV5s. If like, George, was, mentioning to bring up the largest data sets separate, then you can run the MV5 on the underway data fast.
Yeah.
Right?
Mhm.
And then maybe post cruise or even after, or, it gets to us, you could run the MV5
You
on
can,
shore.
yeah, well, you can absolutely do that. The other thing you can do with, I don't, tell you what, I'll talk about that in my session. I don't want to derail yours, but I do, a lot of what you said here, I think I can really help.
Yeah.
You guys meet your goals,
Mhm.
and our stuff's already on 25% of the R2R fleet, so. There might be some good synergy there, but I don't want to derail this.
great. And also I'll plug go ahead.
So you asked about challenges, right? And
Mhm. Yeah.
Raphael is our assigned R2R person. He's wonderful to work with and he's responsive. But one of the things I'm always asking him, one of the things I'm always asking him is how do we improve the quality of our data sets, right? And you guys just put up a bunch of really great best practices. And none of them are on your best practice page except for the MD5. So, you know, some of them are outdated, right? I got told a year ago not to include the UNOLS manifest, but it's still a best practice.
I was promised there'd be no fact check.
I'd say just keeping.
Yeah,
One, two, I mean, I'm only speaking for myself here, but to see, like, put better examples of what a really good solid data set looks like, so that we could copy that if we choose to. And then two, just to keep the website relevant, because I do check it all the time.
great feedback. Yeah,
Just, sorry, but I just wanted to respond to that. Thank you for that. We're also, since we're sort of moving on to like the next 5 years of R2R, we're taking a sort of a larger view of the website and just things that are on it that some that no longer apply, to be perfectly honest. So we're taking a look at that and trying to provide more robust documentation for just to help all of you just have more information and a little more guidance on what would help us and which would then also help you. So we're definitely here to receive all that feedback now and forever.
Just to follow on a little bit of what Eric's suggesting, I went to go look for the data submission page, and it was difficult to find. It wasn't linked in the best practices, which, if that's what you want us to do, would be good to be there. So not a criticism, but if you're good, since you guys are saying you want to look at your website.
yeah. Great. I wanted to plug the R2R check-in tomorrow at lunch. So happy to have you guys. Please come by. Want to talk with you. These conversations are why we're here.
Thoughts from maybe other vessels about what the challenges are with R2R and with data in general?
I have a sort of general question, and see if anybody else is doing this, but we did notice that you're recommending Globus for transferring data. Are there a lot of people transferring data directly from the vessel to R2R over Globus, or from shore first? Yeah.
We do have.
And part of the reason I asked that is I noticed in the NOAA presentation this morning that they are using Globus to go straight from the vessel.
We have one operator right now that's sending us data directly from the ship to our, it's post-cruise, it's not coming real time, right? Because our goal is post-cruise data. Sure. So, but while they're out at sea, they've been shipping it off with reasonably good bandwidth. Getting into us, you know, I mean, it took a couple days. Yeah, fair enough. And you know, that's kind of a goal. We'll see if we can keep pushing that on. See if it wants to. Sure.
Fair enough.
I thought you
To name us and give them credit, that's the celiac. If anyone's interested in how they set it up and what they're doing.
So question about that though. From a bandwidth management standpoint, it would be much more effective to ship daily data rather than in the cruise data. Sure, once a day is done, the day is done. Is that on the roadmap for you guys?
So what you're asking is that we have a portal open and that we just ship daily files across and we assemble distro after that. I think so.
For a ship that's working, you know, it's not gonna be all data every time, but let's just call it, you know, like it's kind of a 90-10 situation. You get 90% of what you want, 10% of the effort.
Right.
So that's, well, EK80 would be a good example. So if you look at individual EK80 files, they're probably like 700 megabytes an hour or so, like CD data essentially in terms of sampling rate. And you know, if we have 5 of them, then that's 700 times 5 an hour, etc. I'm not saying that we have the infrastructure to ship that level of data, but it's much more manageable to think about shipping an hour's worth of EK80 data than it is about a 40 days worth of EK80 data. And so if, you know, different allegory here, but a big thing we try and drill into everybody who travels for SIO is, because we have to pay actuals as log your meals as you go. So you don't have a big pile of receipts to wade through at the end of your travel event. So same kind of thing here. Would it not be more effective to consider having a mechanism for the ship to send data on the daily? So it's a more manageable chunk. It'd be even quicker to catch QA issues, etc.
So the few things that come to mind just from the history of R2R is we've always kind of wanted the operator to finalize cruise data and send it to us as a package so that we can claim it's the entire. So we got, you guys checked off on it. We have it. That's been model. Oh, so a little bit louder. Yeah. Do you want me to repeat some of that?
No, no.
Yeah, okay. And it, you know, it seems like that model might change a little bit. That's the model we've been working with up until now. It's, you guys sign off on it. I think if in the future, if we are using Globus and we can have a landing spot that's big enough that, and you're willing to check off on a cruise at some point, we could start doing more of a daily push and have it aggregated there in a so-called cruise record and build it up until it's done. You say it's done, shut it off. You agree to it. That's a model we can start looking into. Karin, answer.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. I think, one thing that we need to be sure of is that we're handling the archival version of the data. At this point, we're not, if they are coming off real time or near real time that are not the sort of the final version, we don't want to be doing managing those interactions. So if what's coming off as daily packages is confirmed, is done, then I think let's talk about how to accommodate that. But I just wanted that distinction to be clear. I think there's things like that that's not clear.
Well, it's not that it's what you said contradicts my experience, which is sometimes an oopsie is detected, usually because R2R looks at the data, and then the ship is queried, hey, what happened on this date? Oh, whoops, some copy process was misconfigured. And then the archive is updated to compensate. I would wager to guess, and if other ships are doing it differently, but I think most of the technicians are not looking at all the data. So it's really you guys that are going to catch the problems. So I think it's pretty safe to say that 90% of the time, if you take the day's worth of data and transfer it there, it's unlikely to be changed after the fact unless you detect a quality issue. So either way, you would be detecting that potentially mid-cruise and offer the crews an opportunity to course correct before the problem persisted the entire cruise. But you know, if just organizationally, I think it would be easier to think about organizing things by the day than by the cruise, make it more manageable to move over the air.
I just wanted to add onto that thought that if that's somewhere we want to go through, then we really have to think about metadata and making sure, like, if you're going to send that cruise data that day, you need to know the instrument, like, make sure you have all the metadata package with it already. Otherwise, that's going to be missing and it's not going to go on the right cruise. So, like, it would just need to be really organized. And I think this pushes towards what Sean was talking about file formatting, everyone kind of standardizing and then having good documentation, and then we can maybe towards that direction.
Yeah, fair enough. So the answer is you will think about it. Currently not on the roadmap.
I'm flipping a little bit.
Okay.
If you want to send us those data, we can work with you to figure that out. So I didn't think R2R is going to say, hey, please, we're moving to daily data dumps. But if you're able to do that and you see the benefits, then let's work on that.
Fair.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it'd be nice to have a case study that we could build on this.
Okay. I'm just curious, how long did it take Kuliak to transfer the cruise data? I know it was a couple days, but how much data was it?
It varied greatly depending on which link you were using. But I mean, weeks sometimes, but days in other cases. But what I was gonna get at is that if you wanted to move towards like a daily file transfer more for bandwidth management, something like, okay, cool, like allow Globus to grab our data files that were updated in the last 24 hours, ship them ashore. And then at the end of the cruise, yeah, we do our closeout, maybe the text fix some stuff. And then you're only retransferring files that have changed. Or, you know, stuff they've added, like the end of cruise metadata. So you've got like the bulk of it is already ashore. And then we do our end of cruise, cool, we're only transferring, you know, a fraction of the full data set to you. But that's
+1. First base, rsync incremental.
yeah, exactly. So I think that, yeah, oh boy.
So that's a tale as old as time. It really is, and one of the mechanisms that's been deployed on a couple of different ships through the data management system that Pablo and I run is we actually have a mechanism where you do ship-to-shore transfers with a prioritization. So basically, you designate data sets, you give it a priority, and you give it a bandwidth limit. And basically, it sends over in priority to a shoreside facility, and it builds a skeleton of the full directory set. And so basically, so that skeleton lands wherever it is, it's pushing over as much data as the bandwidth allows. It's a prioritized queue, so after an hour, it stops the current transfer, goes back to the top of the list because higher priority data might come in. And then what happens at the end of the cruise is you just rsync what you got from the boat with the directory that came over the air, and they merge.
Right.
Because basically what you've done is you forwarded a subset of the cruise data delivery that you were building on the ship for submission to archive. You're building a subset of that in real time. And that works incredibly well. Now what we can do is it's currently rsync based, but there's an API behind the system. So if you wanted to basically build a Globus or an R clone, AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, whatever, you could basically use the web interface that's allowed for setting the priority queue, for setting the file name filters and all that. And then, you know, use that API, use those API calls to set variables to an R clone or a Globus command line, for that to shore. And then that way, and then at the end of the cruise, you just rsync or R clone or whatever you want from what you got in real time to what you got after the fact.
Right.
And it should merge directly because you were essentially sending exactly what you're going to send on SneakerNet in real time. And doing that priority queue, it does allow you to prioritize, you know, products that ultimately could result in detecting problems with data. And then using the available bandwidth to like, hey, this is something new we want to try, but it's extra bandwidth, but we don't want it to interrupt what we're already doing.
Yeah.
So that kind of what you're describing, I mean, that's something that ships have been asking to do for a long time, and our stuff was doing it for a long time. It just kind of fell out of favor. But that functionality still exists, and actually the one client that is still using it is Saildrone, because they do all of their they run our stuff, and they basically push all of their multi-beam data in real time to the cloud for shoreside processing. I can't get into much detail because of NDAs, but I can tell you it can be done. It is being done operationally.
Yeah, sure.
I'll plant an additional sort of general thought. The more the fleet standardizes, the more R2R can be done. If we're working with, I mean, we've got a couple of additional non-renewal ships, but we're at like 22 vessels right now. If we're working with people doing things 22 different ways, there's only so much we can do. But if the fleet starts to standardize around some of the stuff, then it's more practical for us to do these sort of value-added things.
That's it. Oh, does that working group is part of their charter to set a standard? It's just not clear who is going to set the standard.
It will recommend best practices, which can, well, I don't know, Sean, do you want to answer that?
Did you hear that question, Sean?
Yeah, it sounded like the question was related to who makes the standard. And the idea behind the working group is to get the people in the room to see what's out there and see if there isn't a standard, if there's no standard out there, can we come to a consensus? But it has to include, when you start dealing with standards, you have to include, the techs on the ship that are actually doing the work, the archivists that have to deal with the data, but then you may also have to bring in science as well. Now that wasn't something we had listed in that working group, but the working group may have to engage with science community experts to help set a standard so that they get what they need, But it wasn't really the focus of this working group to set those standards. But again, the working group's charge can evolve, over the course of the 5 years if it's funded.
More of a question for Karen. Where does or maybe Sean, where does the FAIR directive come from? I mean, I know what it is and where it's documented.
Yeah.
Has the sponsor of the ARF directed you to use those standards?
So there is federal policy around ensuring that all products and federally funded research are quickly and openly accessible. And I think there's words in there about usable. I don't remember that memo. But OSTP means FAIR in particular. But one of our drivers is that there's currently data that NCEI will not accept from the fleet because it's not sufficient to describe. We don't have a format document, or the format document doesn't match the data. So that is not getting into the archive, which is the long-term preservation art. You can get it from the R2R portal. So, we do have a mandate to submit our data to NCI, which is the U.S. National Ocean Data Center.
Right.
And so there are components of FAIR that we have to do in order to do that.
And what is NCEI's directive for preservation of that data? Is it 100-year?
I believe it's a 75-year archive.
Yeah, 99.
I mean, that might be the message to give this community, is to start thinking about installations on your vessel where the data is likely to last for 75 years and able to be submitted to NCEI. That might help de-abstract, like turn it into action, make it more of an action-oriented thing. You just start looking at your instrumentation suite and, your maintenance solutions through the lens of this data needs to last this long.
Yeah, so people will be using these data long after we remember what the K80 specifically is, or any specific instrument maker model. It has to be, described well enough that people weren't here now and use it.
Yeah. But I think that might help de-abstract it for some people to say, oh, it's all the stuff I have to do. If the starting point is, we have a goal to, because we're submitting to the National Archive, and we've chosen FAIR as the way to do that. How do we put words into action and start recommending best practices through that lens? But just, ships, they got 800 things to do and 80 seconds to do it. And so the more you can make it action oriented, I think the more success this community will have in helping you.
And we can work on, as you mentioned, the guidance on the website. It's concrete requests with concrete examples of what that looks like.
Go ahead.
It's not something just in my experience, because, I've been lucky enough to work with maybe 20+ ships with their data. And every ship basically is doing the same thing, but they do have a slightly unique requirement to do it, to give a little tweak on it. And so I think, strict conformity, I completely agree in that being the goal, but I don't know how realistic it is given the real world operating requirements of the various institutions. And the suggestion that I give, and it's something that I use as I go to new vessels, is I worry less about strict compliance to a particular directory layout, so much as they've defined what that directory layout is and that that's documented. And so with my stuff, we actually output a JSON file that actually describes in machine readable where everything is. And something that I think could go a step further into coming into compliance with what this goal is talking about is if I can get, or whatever the tool is, can get direction on, okay, how does this need to be documented? So what worries less about, is it this directory or is it in a subdirectory? But there's a strict guidance as to, okay, this is how I document where it is and what rough type it is and all that stuff. Similar to what Sean's doing with Samos, where he's getting that XML file that's very descriptive of all the various sensor data and stuff like that. So the data is coming in a variety of formats. But that one metadata record allows, that's his Rosetta Stone to get everything to conform with whatever backend services it needs. So if there was that type of, that baseline metadata requirement for, we need your directory structure described to this degree, then it allows the institutions to choose a directory structure that more meets their individual institutions' needs while still providing R2R with the machine readable, I write one piece of code that can deal with many formats.
Right.
Yeah, we don't mandate a directory structure, but we just ask for consistency. And the reason is, as outlined previously, we don't want to change distro to distro, or we're expecting files to be. But if we have it consistent, that really, really helps us. And more documentation is always better. So,
Oh, it absolutely does. I was just thinking if there was a machine readable file that allowed, your master program set a configuration, it now knows how to traverse the system. Then that just makes sure, your code is more, is tighter and more repeatable, and the universities have the freedom to do what they need to do for their own unique operational needs.
that'd be cool.
Yeah.
That'd be really cool.
That's probably the best way to answer it.
Yeah.
That's one of the challenges,
Right.
is we get, directory structure and file naming and device lists, and then stuff happens out there that we don't hear about, so we lose data that way.
Yeah.
Because we're getting 1 million files a year, we can't, look at, our ability to actually look at as a human being individual things.
Yeah. Anyone else?
One more minute, anyone have a party?
Go ahead, John.
I don't want to harp on it too much, just to follow on the whole bandwidth impact daily thing. Yeah, putting on my satellite comms management hat. It would present less risk in a world where you're dealing with 5 terabyte a month quotas if that was more steady state, rather than it's the end of the cruise and I'm going to channel a bunch of data down this pipe. And yes, we've got multiple type ships, maybe able to use the small ones can't. They're just going to have Starlink. I think it's a lost to history concept that I remember at least. Was the original reason the internet went on research vessels was to ship science data up.
Oh, really?
Yes, that is why the high seed that project got started. So I would love it if that succeeded one day.
So I guess any vessel is interested in looking at that, thinking more about the daily, contact us. And we can start. But email us after, because I would forget. I walk out of the room, I see people nodding, and drop us a line.
Great. Is that it? Thank you.
All right, thank you guys.